Well, Peg, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Yeah, we were chatting for a while and I was like, we should have been recording that whole time because we were talking about some really important topics regarded to sobriety, not the least of which is, coming to terms with reality and sort of as we come out of this, using experience, trying to reorient to reality and practicing self-examination and stuff. So you have some really interesting ideas that we'll definitely jump into. I do want to start off with a little game. Are you up for playing a little game?
Oh, sure. I'm a gamer. Go ahead. Bring it on. Is it competitive? Can I win? What do I win? What's my valuable prize?
Yes, I'll give you a prize at the end. I don't know what it is, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so this is an easy one for you. Did you have a favorite book that helped you when you first got sober?
Not when I first got sober, but one of my favorite recovery books ever. Anything written by Mary Carr. Her memoir Lit is wonderful, but as are the memoirs she wrote before that. And one of my favorite books of hers is The Liars Club. That was the first one she wrote. And it's powerful. She's funny, and she's just a spectacularly good writer. And Lit is wonderful too.
Okay. I have an Audible credit. So
I think you're going to be logging on for your Audible credit.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to check those out. I've been meaning to. Didn't she wrote some, was there another one that she wrote?
Her second one was called Cherry.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's the one I was thinking.
Yep. And then Lit was her third one. She's trying to get sober.
Okay. Mary Carr.
Mary Carr. Yep.
Mary Carr. I interviewed Nancy Carr. The name of her book escapes me at the moment, but the Carrs are very good writers. We'll say. Do you have a go-to mantra or quote that you live by? Something that kind of keeps coming up for you that has been useful?
I always like to remind myself that the only thing in my control is my attitude in response to situations. I can't control the external world, but I can control my attitude, and I can respond rather than just react to something.
That is the truth. And for me, I would even say that that's true as long as I'm practicing self-care and I have like an internal resource to draw from. Because sometimes I feel good for a long period of time and I forget to do the good things. And then I start reacting and I go, oh, time to get back to self-care.
Where something's out of alignment here. Because I think we do. If we've been sober a long time, we maybe start to cruise along autopilot for a while. We think that, oh, our using days are so far behind us. We're not those people anymore, or that's not my life anymore. But, no matter where you go, there you are, just different versions of yourself. So, I'm about on Peg version 45 at this point. We're always changing, and that's the good news. But sometimes we can change in ways that, when we step back and we look at it, we say, oops, no, I want to get back on this other path, or no, I have work to do on myself. And what an opportunity. We get to work on ourselves. We get to do this work.
Yeah, it is a get to type of thing because that allows us to evolve. We're either evolving or regressing, and nothing ever really stays the same. So that's a really good point. Wait, when did you get sober?
I got sober in 1987. So it's been 35 years.
1987.
1987 was the year I graduated from college. So people, you can do the math. I'm 57.
I graduated in 87, so we're very close.
There we go.
We're very close. 35 years. Congratulations. That's amazing. And listen, you don't get to 35 years without even if it's a range of self-care, right? It's like, I've been sober a while too. And sometimes it drops off a little bit, but what recovery did for me? It decreased my capacity for suffering. So like I get uncomfortable sooner so that I get back on the horse
which is great. So the philosopher William James has an expression for that. He calls it our misery threshold. Each of us has our own misery threshold. How much suffering, how much can we take? And I think you're right that in recovery, we're willing and less able to tolerate suffering as we used to do when we were using. And I think misery threshold is a wonderful alternative to rock bottom. If I can jettison any term from AA, it would be rock bottom, because it makes it seem as if there's some objective point that everyone must hit. And unless and until they hit that point, they won't be willing or able to change. Instead of saying, well, you know what, I just really don't want to be like this anymore. I don't like this suffering. I haven't lost my job. I haven't lost my beautiful wife. I've got the world's best dog, but something in my life needs to change. And I sort of recognize that it's my drug or alcohol use. Then I want to kind of create a new equilibrium and not sink too far away from what I'm able to tolerate. I don't want to get good at tolerating certain things.
I know, right? Yeah. I think we do get good at tolerating the pain, which is why we suffer for so long until you just can't do it anymore. Right. And I heard if your rock bottom is when you decide to quit digging.
Yeah, and I think that's right. But I also think the way that term has been picked up in popular culture, I have talked to more people who have said to me about someone else's drinking or using, well, they haven't hit rock bottom yet. I wouldn't want to sort of cross my fingers and then assume that there is one, or that when they do hit it, they get this miraculous bounce, and then suddenly they're going to decide that they don't want to be this way anymore.
Yeah,
it's just a worrisome term for me. Don't like it.
I could see that. There is that inflection point where you hit the misery threshold, and that does seem a little more palatable than rock bottom. I think rock bottom, it can be too misconstrued.
Yep, I totally agree.
Yeah, that's a good one. When it comes to self-care, do you some people have like a morning routine in addition to like a weekly meeting schedule, in addition to like an annual retreat? What does your self-care practice look like?
So my self-care practice looks like, I love to exercise, and I still love to play a lot of tennis. So I do a lot of that. I find that definitely exercise for me is a mood and emotion regulator. It's important to me, but I love it. I mean, I'm a gym rat by nature. I have always, oh my gosh, I could never be happier than when I was a little kid going to the YMCA and goofing around on all the machines. And so that's still a really important part. That's my early morning. So I'm one of those people who get up fairly early, usually around 4:45 in the morning. And that's just my time. Yep. That's my time. I know no one's going to be bugging me. And for me, it's an opportunity just to try to get attuned to my body and my mental state. I don't ride my bicycle as much as I used to, but riding was always a wonderful way for me to think. I always thought of it as kind of a rolling meditation. But with more distracted drivers these days, I feel like I've got to be totally aware. I can't disengage. And I have a lovely little dog named Clooney, and walking. It turns out I'm both a stress walker and I kind of do walking meditation. And Eckhart Tolle has this wonderful book about dogs and their relationships to us called Guardians of Being. And it's illustrated by the fellow who draws the cartoon strip Mutz.
Oh yeah.
Gosh, what is his name?
I don't know.
I have it somewhere.
But I know what you're talking about. Guardians of Being. I had never even heard of that one.
Oh, it's a wonderful book about how we learn to be present in the now by watching our animals, and to be captivated by smelling a flower, or just, looking out at water, and being so attuned to where you are and not always wondering and worrying about where you're going. Or for those of us who struggled with drugs and alcohol, all that we did. So being here now in the present. So my little dog is an important part of my self-care regimen, even though he rules me. He's got a chubby paw and a velvet glove. Yeah.
That's so funny.
And I couldn't be happier.
Yeah, I hear you. I have an English bulldog who is my shadow, and he does remind me to be present, especially when he's snoring and I'm trying to meditate.
I'd be sound asleep. I would be sound asleep if I were listening to my dog snore. I'd be like, oh, the power of suggestion. Out cold.
Seriously. Do you practice like the traditional sitting quiet meditation or with music or anything like that?
No, because I will fall asleep. If you dim the lights on me, same thing when I was a kid. I was just talking to a friend about this, watching film strips in elementary school when they would close the Venetian blinds and then have the film strips on. I would be out cold every time, even as a little kid. So that I have not developed a true meditation practice, but I also spend a lot of time in my head. So I'm a philosopher by training, and I'm an
Yeah.
introvert by nature. And, I'm pretty comfortable with self exploration
Yeah.
and attentiveness, not having had the benefits of formal training in meditation.
Right. I mean, I would argue that the walking meditation is a valid form of
Mhm.
meditation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. Um, so so interesting. So we're going to talk about your book today. I have it written down: Higher and Friendly Powers, Transforming Addiction and Suffering. And I have been asking people as of late to share their spiritual experience stories, whether it's how you define a spiritual experience or maybe a situation that happened that made you feel like there is a higher power and maybe it does love me. What does that mean for you or if you have a story to share, whatever you want to share on that?
Yeah, I'm not so sure I have a story, but I think my spirituality is very much connected to both reaching inward to myself and reaching outward and making connection, or even a kind of a stronger term is communion.
Mm,
Finding, making connection, communion with other human beings for sure, but with the beauty that is nature and other kind of animals. And I was really impacted. Um, so Henry David Thoreau, writing Walden in the 1860s, I think it is. I'm terrible with dates. Philosophers don't care about dates. So he's living at Walden, trying to get away from the hustle and bustle of, Concord, Massachusetts at the time, not too far from where his mother lived. So he could go home for lunch if you get hungry or lonely. But he's out walking one day in the woods at Walden Pond on a misty day. And he talks about feeling a communion with the pine needles, feeling a
mm,
sense of connection to him, and realizing that he is just part of nature like everyone else, and that there was a kind of expansiveness in there that I have no desire to believe that I, as an individual, or we as human beings, are superior to everything else on the planet. And I'm more concerned with making connection and common cause and being open to finding connection and common cause, perhaps where I might never expect it. So for me, spirituality is about expansiveness. It's about inclusivity. It's about pluralism, not believing that there is one right, true religion, or there is only one God and it is God of this particular plug in a denomination. But that spirituality is a fundamental part of human nature. And it's up for each one of us to decide how we want to understand spirituality, and most importantly, how we live it. Spirituality isn't about beliefs. It's about how we are in the world with ourselves and with others, however broadly we define that category of others.
that is so good. Beliefs versus how we are.
Yeah, I
That's
mean, I think
good.
spirituality is it's a living attitude. It's a living engagement with everything that's in the world or the cosmos, or the universe. If I
Yeah.
studied more Taoism, I think I would be more of a Taoist. That
Yeah.
human beings are miniatures of the cosmos.
Yeah.
That's what we are. And how incredibly cool is that? Because it makes us continuous with everything else. Whereas, say, in the Western tradition, we tend to think of human subjectivity and other, there's culture, there's nature, there's subject, there's object. And, those distinctions oftentimes are hierarchical and they're oppressive or repressive. And I'm just more interested in all the different ways that we connect.
Yeah. I like to think of it instead of that we're in a circle, not a ladder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I like things simple.
Simple oftentimes is a virtue that we misunderstand, because oftentimes, say in science, they'll say the most elegant theories are the simplest in a sense. They explain the most, and they don't have a lot of add-on features or what ifs or, ad hoc, add something on to explain, some case over here. So there's elegance and beauty in simplicity. I wouldn't underestimate that.
Yeah, I feel like we're complicated creatures and we easily complicate things, and it's nice to have, like, in 12-step programs are a simple program for complicated people, and I really connected to that idea. Easy, it makes it easy to remember. That's it for the game. That wasn't too bad, was it?
No, I like that game. I hope I did well, because I'm an overachiever people pleaser.
Yes. I'm gonna send you 2 gold stars.
2 gold stars. Ooh, they're going on the refrigerator.
I know. I mean, you're a professor at, where are you teaching?
Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. It's a Swedish Lutheran college.
Swedish Lutheran.
Yep, the Swedish Lutherans have always been the very liberal ones.
Okay. Yeah, I think some people would argue that universities are typically liberal unless they're under the Catholic persuasion,
or certain religious denominations. Colleges that we'd say aren't very liberal or progressive, but the Swedes have in general been more progressive.
Yeah, I could see that. I want to go back a little bit to sort of, how did we get here? You're talking about 35 years of sobriety, but I think it's so interesting to kind of go to what were things like in your family of origin. I used to ask people all the time, what did your dad do for a living? What did your mom do? Because that kind of sort of sets the stage and says a lot. How would you answer that question?
So I have 2 older siblings, so I'm the youngest. So we always know that the final draft is the best, most polished draft. Says the youngest
the wildest.
Child. Okay, and usually the wildest, yes. And 2 parents, and they were married the entire time. And wow. I was a happy little kid. I loved life. I was fun. I had a good sense of humor. And still do. Still love to laugh inappropriately and get in trouble all the time. That's an important thing. Although I went to Catholic school, and my mother passed away this fall, and I was going through some of her things, and she'd saved a few report cards of mine from Holy Family Elementary School. And in 3rd grade, I do want it known that it was noted on my report card, my sister Julia, that I showed Christian behavior. I was a little troublemaker. I was the tallest kid in the class. I was always in the back row. I was up to something. I was busy. I was a teacher's nightmare, probably. But a couple of things started to happen. One of which was older boys. And, it's taken me a long time to say this publicly, but, I would argue being sexually abused by older boys, as a young kid, when I was 9. And to hit the rewind button to that Catholic context, anything having to do with sin, everything having to do with sex was dirty and sinful. So, right. I'm in 5th or 6th grade feeling like, oh my God, I'm filthy and I'm sinful. So that was kind of an important part of why I started to drink as soon as I hit high school. Yeah. And then the other thing is that I was starting to realize that I had 0 interest in boys, none. Zippo, unless they were on the other side of the tennis net. And so, there's another problem for me. So there's some more shame. And then the final thing to go into my shame pot was I quickly started drinking very differently from all my friends. So it was like the trifecta of shame, the abuse, sexual orientation, and then what became clear to me by the time I was a sophomore, junior in high school was that I was a raging alcoholic. So all of that shame, I think, just I know we talk about, shame, it can stain you in a kind of way. And I've been thinking about a different metaphor for shame. So before we had paper and pencil, we had parchment, and people would write on parchment, you carve into it. And parchment was so rare and so precious that you'd want to reuse it repeatedly. So you could scrape it or you could scrub it, and then you could write over it again. But those earliest layers of writing never fully disappear. Under certain conditions in the light, you can always see them, and they're called the scriptio inferiori. And for me, I feel like those three things were carved so deeply on Peg O'Connor as a young person that they were always there in a kind of way, even with, years of therapy and going on and getting educated and having a good career and different things like that, that they're always there. And so I would say that my addiction very much was motored by that shame. And I think that's a thing to learn in recovery, is that we can stop drinking, but some of those shame-based elements or dimensions or layers of writing are still there. And so how do we learn to live with them? How do we figure out how to keep them right-sized, or how do we figure out how to transform them, or how do we maybe even befriend them in a kind of way?
Ooh,
and, I think that's that kind of befriending. You and I were talking earlier about self-care. I mean, how do you come to befriend parts of yourself that everything in our culture have taught us to revile or to hate, or that we can't always, there's no psychological equivalent of the roto-rooter. We can't roto-root ourselves. It's there. So how do we try to incorporate it more? Or how do we, I think, sometimes make intentional decisions to say, I'm just going to cordon this piece of me off. I'm going to abjure it. I'm going to just say, this doesn't get to define me in a kind of way. It's here, but I'm putting it away. And those are the really hard questions of living in recovery without having chemicals affect our ability to see these things or our willingness to engage with them.
Yeah, those are really tough. Yeah, the sexual abuse, that'll change you. That'll change you
Oh,
at a
it changes
fundamental
you.
level.
Yep.
What was it, a ongoing thing that was happening? Was it a one-time thing?
It went on for a couple of years. And
Okay.
as they were older boys. They were, I think, 2 and 4 years older. So, this is, I think, the sick part of our culture. For years I thought, well, was it really abuse? Was it,
Oh,
well,
yeah.
I would,
So
so you
confusing.
start thinking, oh, I was complicit in it, or, I didn't tell, or, I went along with it. And for the longest time, that part of me was so removed. And actually, this is probably the most I've talked about it publicly. It was so removed that I had no access to what a 9 to 12-year-old kid was like.
Mm-hmm.
And then, when I would meet 9-year-old kids, I think, oh my God, that's how old I was.
Yeah, you're a baby.
I wasn't the shrunken, just shorter version of 20 something, 30 something, 40 something Peg. I was this little peanut, but I had no access to sort of what it was like to be that kid, because I couldn't get there. I couldn't access that kid.
I think it's so important. So what you're talking about, this, when you said remove, my mind immediately went to disassociated, like our psyche does these incredible mental gymnastics to survive, right? And all the things that you were saying about being complicit, I didn't tell, I went along with it. That happened to me too. And when I was very young, and it does something to your mind, and it does something to your identity.
Oh my
Because,
gosh.
right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It does. And it's really interesting. If you know the work of Bessel van der Kolk, so he's a psychiatrist who works a lot with, PTSD, but he works a lot with children. And he has been arguing, and his organization has been arguing for a different diagnosis for people who are abused or subjected to a lot of traumatic events or different forms of trauma. as kids, and he calls it developmental trauma disorder.
Mm.
That, psychologists are always talking about developmental stages. So when you're this age, you learn to differentiate yourself from others. When you're that age, you learn how to
Right.
self-soothe. When you're this age, you learn how to, you know, navigate social settings and, maintain relationships. And, those who are abused, those developmental stages tend to be shortened or interrupted, or they really get skewed in a kind of way. And so, that's coming at it from the psychological neuroscience approach. I come to it from the approach of a moral philosopher, thinking about there are the expression from a wonderful feminist philosopher, Annette Beyer, is essential arts of personhood. And that traumatic experiences fundamentally hinder some people from acquiring the essential arts of personhood, which certainly have to do with things like our ability to think rationally and to engage in deliberation, all those kinds of capacities. But I think about other kinds of capacities, like learning how to hope, and to hope well or to hope appropriately, to be able to use your imagination and not just always get on the non-stop bullet express to worst case scenario, but to be able to imagine maybe good possibilities, the ability to maintain, bodily self-possession, that, this is my body, I'm in charge of it. Here's what I should be able to say to other people who want to violate that in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that, for me as a moral philosopher, comes down to how do people learn how to be in the world as connected, responsible agents or people who can make intentional choices and follow through on them and set goals and agendas, and to be able to have goals and aspirations, because oftentimes, people who have been severely traumatized, they can't ever imagine good things happening. They can't engage in that kinds of means ends thinking. Well, if this is my goal out here, then I need to meet this sub goal, and then I'll meet that sub goal, and then all those things are interrupted. And that's so integral to what it means to be a human being. But things like trauma and abuse fundamentally hinder some people. And so then many go on to develop addictions. There's a pretty straightforward relationship between adverse childhood experiences and developing substance use disorders. So, okay, now we start to sober up, and we're developmentally behind in some ways. Mm-hmm. Or we have taken adaptive ways of being, and they've become maladaptive because they have kind of steeped through to other dimensions of our lives where it turns out we're not well served by them.
That's so interesting, because I often hear in 12-step rooms that your emotional development ends when your drinking begins. So like when you get sober, they go, oh, how old were you when you started drinking? I don't know, 14. Well, that's where you are emotionally and developmentally. And
I think some people might be even earlier than that.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially if you're saying that, how trauma affects the development. There's a great book. Have you read that book, What Happened to You, by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey?
I haven't read that one.
Oh, you would love it, because it really speaks to how, so he was a doctor that worked with children that had trauma. And so the title is a slight variation of, not because usually it's like, what's wrong with you? Is usually and it's a very aggressive question, actually. And this is,
oh my God,
right? What's wrong with you? But that's often how we talk to ourselves. It's like, what is wrong with me? But this is such right? This is such a more gentle way of like, what happened to you? Right. And it sort of almost instantly shifts the energy and creates a safe space for the receiver of that question to change a little bit and a little more relaxed.
Yeah, because I think it gives you a different explanatory framework from other than you so screwed up, or you're the kind of person who always F things up, or of course this happened to you, you asked for it, you deserved it, and all that, instead of saying, well, let's take a look at everything that has gone into making you who you are. And
Yeah.
I think that gets back to that control thing that, any of us, even in our mature states, even if we are sober in recovery, we still have so little control. And when you're a kid, you have even less control. So you kind of take on these judgments wholesale because you don't really have a good repertoire of other ways of making sense of yourself, or this is what the people you trust are telling you, or people who have authority are telling you. Of course, you're going to believe it. And then, to piggyback on something that we talked about earlier before we started recording, we take those beliefs to be so true that we get caught up in a vicious cycle of confirmation bias where everything bad that happens to us well because I'm a bad person. So there's a vicious circularity there that really reinforces that it's more than a negative view about myself. We take it to be the truth of myself. We think we have access to our truth so that even if we do get some therapy and we clean up, we know that deep down underneath us in the deepest recess, we see the true, each one of us sees our true self that no one else can. And that's just, well, A, I think it's a fallacy, but B, that is so damaging.
So damaging. Yeah. I think recovery for me was about, questioning my beliefs. And, they talk about, you get to the rooms, it's open-minded, honest, and willing, or honest, open-minded, and willing, because we have to like re-examine our core beliefs, and it's a difficult process to the whole self-examination thing. I didn't learn any of it until I got sober. I'm curious.
And I think that's right. Yeah. Because I think some people don't really even have core beliefs. Right. They don't know who they are or what they stand for. I mean, they've been told who they are. They've been told everything that what's wrong with you, right? The judgment in the form of a question. But I mean, to think about having to come to form very intentionally your identity, or, moral philosopher here likes to talk about your character, that we have to do that, and we get to do it. We get to be more proactive in defining who we are.
Yeah. The thing that was so interesting to me about early sobriety, it's completely disorienting. And I'm curious about what your experience was like. But for me, it was like so disorienting that I had to, redefine my identity, because I wasn't the, I wasn't the party girl anymore. And if I wasn't that, who was I going to be? I'm curious. So you mentioned that you got sober in 87 when you graduated college. Was there a defining experience or moment that you were just like what was when you were you were laughing? Oh, she's disappeared off camera.
She's banging her head on her desk.
If you're not watching this on YouTube, she disappeared for a second.
Oh, sure. There was a totally defining moment. So I was someone who would, during athletic seasons, I wouldn't drink because my sports were so important to me. I wasn't going to drink. And so
what sports did you play?
I played tennis and squash. Anything with a racket, I'm happy.
Okay.
Give me something to hit and I'm happy.
Pickleball? Are you a pickleball fan?
I haven't done that yet.
Oh, okay.
Haven't done it yet. But so I wouldn't drink during season, and then I'd start up at the end of season. But for me, the proof I wasn't an alcoholic was the fact that I stopped. That I started again, that was just an inconvenient fact that I was just put off to the side.
True.
Yeah. And so I graduated with college. I had no clue what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't go to the career center. I was just lost because I did drink so much, and I was lost. And I think addiction is a form of losing yourself. And so I was 100%. Lost in my addiction, and I was lost because I didn't have any plans. I didn't, all of my friends, they're going to go work here. They're going to this grad school. And I'm like, I don't know. And so in August, I had an absolutely terrible car accident and should have been killed, but I wasn't. And I hadn't been drinking, but I would have been in a couple of hours. And so I landed in the hospital, and I had a severe concussion. So that's going to factor into sort of how I sobered up. So I'm in a lot of pain. I got some broken bones, head went out through the side window and all that sort of thing. And I was in the hospital bed in Middletown, Connecticut. And I remember the nurse came and offered me pain relievers. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I thought, Betty Ford, here I come. So Betty Ford, First Lady Betty Ford, had started the Betty Ford Treatment Center in the 1970s. She was one of the first very out public figures with her addictions. And what did she do? She founds a treatment center. And I thought, I will end up in treatment because I will abuse these drugs, because I know what I did with alcohol. I know that I loved cocaine, but cocaine did not love me. I'm grateful. It gave me debilitating headaches. So I couldn't do it. I'm so grateful for that, because then it turns out later that, well, I have a little heart problem, so I could have blown my heart out. I would have been like Len Bias.
That's a spiritual experience.
But not even that, Len Bias was the first round draft pick of the Boston Celtics in the mid 80s. And he died of major cardiac infarct from cocaine. And so, that was in my mind. But I thought, Betty Ford, here I come. And so I got released from the hospital, and I'm completely emotionally flatlined. And now I understand that was the concussion. That was the traumatic brain injury. And I didn't give a rip that I had lived. I didn't care whether I lived or whether I died. I felt absolutely nothing. I was emotionally flatlined. And I ended up going back to my parents' house for a couple of weeks to recover. And I realized that I hadn't really had anything to drink. I hadn't had anything to drink since the day before the accident. And I thought, well, why not see how long this can go? And I'm going to treat it like an experiment, because I've, effed it up every other time, but why not? I didn't even care enough to drink, is what it comes down to.
Wow.
And that's what I'm still running on. That I haven't had a drink since that car accident.
Years later.
And for me, treating it as an experiment means that I need to take a more proactive, attentive relationship to it, because experiments need to be tended. They need to keep an eye on them. They can't just run in the background. And so that's how I understand my sobriety. And I had gone to one AA meeting as an undergraduate, and then I ran out of there because the language of higher power just totally was a turnoff for me, coming out of that Catholic background. And, the notion that God was always watching me. So God already knew every terrible, sinful, shameful thing that I had done. And I thought, well, if I got to rely on that big guy to get sober, it ain't happening. And so I stopped drinking, and I wouldn't say that I was a dry drunk, but I think it took a long time for me to kind of come out of that severe concussion that I had. And then I figured out more maybe of what I wanted to do with my life. And I'd been sober for 3 years, and I had started graduate school, and I met some new friends. I did the geographic cure. I moved halfway across the country for graduate school, and I made new friends playing tennis. That's how I meet people. That, dog walking, and AA. And if you've got all three, whoa, you're my best friend. And we had just played some great tennis, and then we went to the bar, and I'm sitting at the bar with these people who don't know me from Adam, really. And I said, I think I'm going to have a beer. I haven't had a beer in about 3 years. And this person I barely knew, she said, well, wait a minute. If you haven't had a drink in 3 years, maybe
don't.
Maybe there are reasons why you might not want to have it now. And it was just that nice little interruption that instead made me order a Diet Coke. And I think I had to be open and willing to hear that, though, right? I mean, I could have just poo-pooed it.
Yeah.
And so there was always this part of me that worried. And particularly, 3 years into it, still pretty new. And now in a new city, going back to school and, feeling like, do I fit in with all these really smart people? And then, how did I get in? That must have been a glitch of the admissions process. And so, yeah, that's how I sobered up. It was by accident and non-intentional for a while. And then 20 years in, I realized that I need to do something differently, because I was cruising. I was taking it for granted. I was running on autopilot. And I didn't recognize myself or my life anymore. And I thought, that's familiar to me because I didn't recognize myself or my life when I was drinking. Here I am not drinking, and I'm being a good, responsible member of society, and I'm productive, and I have a job, and I'm doing well in it, and I have the perfect dog, and all of that. And I thought, I don't recognize myself. I don't recognize my life. I need to make some different choices. So I met some people.
20 years sober?
This 20 years in. Yep. And so
Okay.
that's when I started going to some AA meetings, but I still had the same problem with the higher power language.
Okay.
But I like the people.
Yeah.
So
how did you get around it?
It turns out I don't get around it so well. I dip in and out of AA, although my closest friends are people in recovery, some of whom are still in AA and some of whom aren't.
So just to clarify, you go to meetings, but have you done the 12-step exercises? Because meetings are not the program.
Well, it's interesting. What is the program?
The program is working the steps as it's written out in the big book.
Yes and no, because the fellowship is also the program. I mean, there's understanding the 12 steps and the book Alcoholics Anonymous as a program for recovery, but it's suggestions or recommendations, not requirements.
Right.
And so for me, I've always felt more kinship. So to go back to that notion of connection and expansiveness or communion with the people and not with the program as it's written. That's where I struggle. Is with the 12 steps, with the language of God as we understood him, that I find that still very alienating to me. And I know that there can be a fair amount of variation between meetings, but most of the meetings I was going to end with the Lord's Prayer. I'm not the biggest fan of how it works, of that reading. I find that very alienating because I felt as if AA wasn't working for me when I was being honest about it, because I couldn't accept that notion of God, but I didn't want to say that to publicly because that's part of the program. So then is my failure as a young person to be sober a function of my being constitutionally incapable of something and being unwilling? And to me, it started to feel, and it's still, I do struggle with this. For me, when I listen to how it works, it makes it seem as if there's a kind of negative judgment or blame. Rarely have we seen people fail
who have thoroughly followed the path.
Well, yeah, however that goes.
Yeah, so, yeah, whatever words.
Rarely have we seen a person fail who thoroughly follows our path. And I think, well, there's kind of, well, I guess if I were a social scientist, I'd say sort of the pool is slightly skewed because so many people leave AA because of the God language.
They really do.
Which is unfortunate because I think AA is an amazing program. I really do. I love the 9-step promises. I love the fact that there's a democratic flavor to AA, that there are no experts there, that meetings have a kind of autonomy, that our primary focus is to help people stay sober. I love all of that, but I always struggle with, and again, this is a relationship between what is the program? Is it the written stuff or is it the people? Those two come together, where I did try to have a sponsor one time, and she is what I would call
go ahead and say it. Go ahead and say it.
I would say she was kind of a big book thumper.
Yeah.
Something of an AA fundamentalist.
Yeah.
And that wasn't going to work with me.
Yeah.
That had zero chance of gaining any purchase.
So interesting. Yeah. So here's what I want to call out. You stayed sober for 35 years without it.
I did.
Right. So there are many paths. And I think what
Yes.
I'm writing a whole book about I'm calling it the 12-step exploration guide, because I do want to address and offer different context and perspective to some of these ideas. And one of the first things I got to call out is the higher power issue, because it's even underlined as we understood him. Right.
Yes.
Okay. So I take issue with the gentrification of a higher power. But when I sat down with a sponsor, she helped me to understand, like, and so it was explained to me that the program is different than the fellowship. The program, it says it in the book that it's it's largely a writing exercise is what it is. And so during that writing exercise is when she helped me to understand what a higher power meant for me. And
Mhm.
so, God is just a symbol, and we assign meaning to the symbol, right? And so she was like, what do you think it is? And I was like, well, this is what I think it is, because I grew up in a religious household. And she's like, well, what would you want it to be? And I was like,
Mhm.
well, it has to be like energy. It has to be love. It has to be compassionate and all these other things. And she's like, okay, throw out all the shit that doesn't work for you. And now what God means is this thing that you understand. It's going to evolve. You're never really going to be able to pin it down, and that's okay. And I was all cool. So that's how we moved forward. It's like, I'm a science girl, so I believe in like energy and a God of evidence
Mhm.
and all that. So that's how I kind of got around it. But we went through the whole writing exercise, which is the program. And I wouldn't, I always did the meetings, because that's where I was hearing people tell their stories. It's the
Right.
stories that
Yes.
were so powerful.
And those stories are powerful because we learn about other people, but
Yeah.
then those stories we can think about in terms of ourselves. So when I hear
Yeah.
you say something, you did this, oh, I did the same thing, and here's how you came out, and oh, here's what I'm doing. I mean, hearing other stories is so important to self-knowledge, and it's so
Yeah.
important for self-love and for self-forgiveness. Right?
Huge.
Those
Huge.
are there's nothing harder, I think, than those three together: self-love,
Mhm.
self-knowledge, and self-forgiveness. And
Mhm.
and I think we learn how to do that with others. And that's part of the power of AA. It's part of the power, I would say, of Women for Sobriety or for Rational Recovery, any kind of groups where
Smart recovery is
Smart
also,
Recovery,
yeah,
Life Ring, where people
life ring.
are
Yeah.
together learning and teaching each other and, yeah, sharing their experience, strength. Oh, and hope. There's that essential art, hope. We learn how to hope. We learn how to imagine good things for ourselves
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
seeing others do it, right? That's the 9-step promises. So
Yeah.
part of the reason why I wrote this book, Higher and Friendly Powers, is
Yeah.
that term higher power came from the American philosopher William James. And he
Mhm.
used it in this remarkably expansive, inclusive kind of way. He said, a
Yeah.
higher power is something more that causes you to reach outward or inward. It could be
Yeah.
ideals like truth or beauty. It can be a sense of human decency or enthusiasm for mankind, patriotism, moral
Mhm.
principles, even a better version of yourself.
Mhm.
And Bill Wilson had read some William James, and so he adopted that term higher power, but he lost the expansiveness of it and he contracted it to God as we understood him. So he
Mhm.
imported a very Christian centric framework, a monotheistic framework. And
Mhm.
this book is meant in some ways as an invitation for people who have a hard time with AA and higher power to have that sort of engagement that you had with your sponsor to figure out what's a higher power for you, because there are
Mhm.
as many higher powers at least as there are individuals. And that
Mhm.
what William James says is anything larger will do if it helps you to take the next step to
Right.
become willing.
Yeah.
And so, in some ways, this book is more than a 35-year itch that I've wanted to scratch about higher power, to say, well, if Bill Wilson does truly regard William James as a co-founder of AA, even though James died about 25 years before, that book was so influential, Varieties of Religious Experience, then I want to get James right on his own terms. And to say it's a higher and friendly power with which you feel continuity, that you begin to, you come to have faith, which is merely just a willingness to live on possibility, where the results aren't certified in advance. It's not faith in a divinity. It's just a working, you're the scientist, I'll say to you, it's a working hypothesis.
Right.
And science traffics in faith as much as any religion does.
Yeah.
Right. They posited the God particle before they had the collider that could prove it. That's a working hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so, you know, for me, I would love if more people could find AA to be more inviting and accepting of their notions of higher powers, because that's so hard when you're still active in your addiction and you come into a space. It's hard to kind of do the Taekwondo block moves of, but I don't believe in a Christian providential God, or I don't believe in this kind of divinity. And then I hear I'm being dishonest if I'm not, but no, I can't do it. So, you know, I think early in sobriety, many of us are hitchhikers. We hitchhike.
I think that
others.
Yeah, we were talking before about, you know, how disorienting early sobriety is, because you're establishing your identity, you're sort of redefining what and the sad thing is we don't even know who we really are, right? And so I think that's why getting a sponsor and a guide for someone who's already been through it, you're relying on somebody's practical experience rather than your own uninformed opinions. I think that's one of the really important functions of a sponsor. You mentioned earlier that, and this was one thing I thought would be so interesting to discuss, is, you know, to be in that period of using, we have to come up with all these ideas to rationalize and justify our behavior. And we're not really living in reality. You know, one of the things that I heard early on was see things as they are. And I had a very difficult time seeing myself as I was. That's why the 4-step was so powerful for me. It was the first time I had a process of real self-examination. And I know that you teach ethics and philosophy and trauma. How does one wrestle with their own self-examination process? Like, my biggest fear was always that I would be in some kind of denial or have an inability. You know, the open-mindedness was really important to me. There's that Einstein quote, "A problem can't be solved at the same level of thinking that created it." And I was like, oh my God, it's the thinking. There's a problem.
It's the thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, my brain was the one, that's where the problem is. And we're often blind to our own, you know, beliefs that aren't even ours. They're adopted by the people that raised us. So how does one start off in sobriety? Like, you did it on your own. You had to find a way for the world to make sense to you. What would you offer in terms of, you know, critical thinking and re-identifying your current sober self?
I think that's one of the most crucial tasks, because I will say for me, and I think it's true of many others, that then when we get into early recovery, we don't trust ourselves because we have done so many things to show us to be untrustworthy, or we take ourselves to have done so many. Oh, and there's the gap between actually what we may have done and what it is that we think we've done. That I think many people active in addiction oftentimes feel so bad that they kind of overestimate everything that they have ever done wrong, and they
catastrophize, blow it out.
They catastrophize. It's like a big mushroom cloud of, you know, here are all the terrible things that I have done. And we quickly move from the judgment, I have done terrible things, to I am a terrible person. which becomes the framework for why I do those particular things. Well, why'd you do those particular things? Oh, that's because I'm a terrible person, right? So there's that very
that
kind of
spiral,
vicious.
huh? Yeah.
It's a vicious spiral, and I think one of one of the earliest casualties in early addiction is losing self-trust. And one of the hardest things to get back is self-trust. And oftentimes we only get self-trust back when we begin to trust some other people. So I think that's why it's really important in groups like AA, Smart Recovery, Life Ring, that we learn about ourselves by hearing from others how they see us or how they experience us. So it may come as a total newsflash that someone regards me as being really reliable because I have shown up every week with the key to unlock the door so that we can have our meeting. Because for me, I'm just the screw up. I've been the family screw up. I mean, all these stories that we've told ourselves so much that we just quickly slip into them. And to be able to hear from others to say, you've really been reliable. This meeting couldn't have happened without you. You are always here. You are someone that we can always count on. That has to start counting for information, that you can't always discount what it is that people have said about you. So what happens when you start to see yourself through the eyes of actual others, not imaginary others, because you'll always see yourself as bad. When you see yourself through the eyes of actual others, it starts to count as data.
Yeah.
Right. But you have to learn how to do it. And that's one of those great skills that perhaps you never got the opportunity to learn well, because the environments in which you should have been learning how to trusting is a skill. And you can do it too easily, too willy-nilly. That makes you gullible, or you can not trust enough. And so you're closed off in a kind of way. To learn how to trust is a skill. It's a virtue, but that's always developed with others. And so for me, while I didn't have AA, I had others in my life who were helping me to do that and who still help me to do that.
Yeah.
They provide an important corrective to how I see myself, because it turns out oftentimes we get it very wrong about who we are or what we are or what we've done or how we think others are judging us.
Yeah. I think what's so missing in our self-examination, prior to sobriety, in fairness, after sobriety too, is this component of compassion, right? Like I didn't understand that I was behaving badly, not because I was a horrible person, but because I was practicing survival skills. I was trying to get a need met, and I didn't know how to go about it in a, viable way.
Yep.
Right. Like I used people, I was selfish and self-centered, I left a wake of destruction in my path. Not because I was a bad person, it's because I was in a lot of pain and I was desperate for relief, and I behaved badly because of it.
And you didn't know how to get what you needed in healthy, respectful to you and to others kinds of ways. So there are those skills again. I mean, it's weird to think about that, as kids, as young adults, as middle-aged adults, we're still learning some pretty basic skills.
Yeah. I mean, that is my light bulb moment for this conversation, is trust is a skill. I actually never thought of it that way. Yeah. But you're right. And I have often thought that, you can't escape the same measuring stick that you judge others by. And working with others, it was so interesting. Like I would work with other women and they would tell me about stuff that they were doing. And I was like, I did that shit too. But I loved them. I could see that they were suffering and they felt horrible about what they did. And I had such compassion for them. And then it was almost inevitable that when I looked at myself, I was like, well, why wouldn't I deserve that same compassion? Like I need to turn that around.
Yeah. And I think sort of when we look inside, when we think we know the truth about us, when we've got the privileged access that no one else has, what we're seeing are the distortions from the equivalent of funhouse mirrors. They're convex and they're concave.
Oh,
And
good.
they distort us. But when we see it in someone else, this person just did the same things that I did. You see it clearly for the first time, although you've been assuming you've been seeing it clearly when you look at you.
Yeah,
But
I've often thought,
they're funhouse mirrors.
but that's a great analogy. I've often thought that emotion colors our perspective, especially towards ourselves. And that comes back to, seeing things as they are. And it's
Mhm.
so important that to surround ourselves with a community that can be supportive and call out the truth.
Yes, and offer the correctives. And that's what the
Yeah.
right group of friends or the right group of support people in recovery can do. What's the acronym for fear? False evidence appearing real.
I have another one
Um,
for you.
okay, bring it on.
Fuck everything and run.
Oh, there's that. Yeah.
I know there's several others, but
But that's
yeah,
the whole thing that, one of the sets of skills we haven't developed well when we're beginning to use or really
yeah,
active in it is to
yeah.
be able to
Or
differentiate between
oh,
what's just apparent or what's real.
yeah, there's Face Everything and Recover. That one's good too.
Yeah.
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 Um, I was going to ask you, I almost forgot to ask you about this. I want to be respectful of your time, but I think it would be so important. So when this episode is released, it'll be after the holidays, but I suspect that there will be a fair amount of people who will be still reeling from, family get-togethers or
Yeah.
holiday events with people. And we were talking about how we can still love people who have fundamentally different opinions than us. How and during this, early recovery or even late recovery, let's be honest, because still human, right?
And still going to family gatherings. Yep.
Right, not everybody changes. How do we maintain our peace and still choose to see love or see the good in somebody, even though they're holding and presenting some hateful or problematic
Mhm.
ideas?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we not reduce people in all of their complexity to political positions or moral
Mm,
positions.
moral
That I
position.
think we hated it if we were reduced to, oh, she's just an addict, that just
Oh, yeah.
right? We hate that reduction when it was done to us, and we should not want to do that, visit that reduction on anyone else. That people are so complex and multifaceted. We are all mixed bags. You
For
know,
sure.
we are mixes of sweet and savory, bitter and sweet, harsh and mellow. And we can focus just on the things that really, really annoy the shit out of us.
Mhm.
But when we do that, we might think that may be the very thing that's in me that annoys about others, right? Always important to have that kind of that
I
relationship going on.
I have to
Um,
share this. I have to share this one thing with you. Is this? I think it was Dan Millman who wrote "The Way of the Peaceful Warrior," talking about you can't love or hate something about somebody unless it's something you love or hate about yourself. And that was always kind of confusing to me. But so I reduced it to if you spot it, you got it.
oh,
It's,
yep. That just works perfectly. I
yeah,
mean, whether it's a really good trait
it could be a
or
good
whether it's
trait
a trait
too.
you can't stand.
Yeah, it can be good too. I heard Deepak Chopra talking about this concept, and he was like, if you have the courage, you can use it for evolution. And that was like, I mean, that was like a challenge to me. I was like, oh yeah, I'm totally gonna use this. So whenever I'm really mad at somebody, I write down what it is I think is the problem with them. And then I think, how am I like that? And where can
Oh
I bring
yeah.
compassion? I think compassion is really the end result. It's like, where can I be compassionate
And we can be compassionate when we see people in their complexity.
in their complexity? That reminds me of the whole yin and yang thing. Like, even in the
Yes.
good person, there's a little bit of bad, and vice
Even in
versa.
the light, there's dark, and in the dark, there's some light. But the thing about sort of the yin yang is that they're oppositions, but they're not hostile oppositions.
They're not hostile.
No, no,
Why?
no. Um, because light and dark don't have to be hostile. I think in Western thinking, we think of everything in dichotomies or dualisms where the opposites are always antagonistic. But
Right.
opposites don't have to be antagonistic at all.
They say opposites attract.
Well, and they can be harmonious in a kind
And
of way.
harmonious.
So what would it be like instead of seeing, someone who I think is a complete opposite of me as a hostile manner? I mean, to go into a situation to think, what can I learn about this other person or about this situation? What can I learn about myself? And, I think what's really hard too is that I think we as a culture have become less willing to listen and to listen well to other people. And we've gotten really, the philosopher Montaigne wrote that impatience is the great ruin of many people.
Impatience.
Impatience. Yeah.
And
I think that's right, because we want to hurry up and get people to change, or we want to hurry up and change ourselves. We want to rush processes that, no, sometimes there are some things that can't be rushed. And so, when you are in these family situations, sometimes it really comes down to a cost benefit analysis. It's just not worth it for me to engage on these kinds of questions on this topic with these people over here, because I don't want to start hating them.
That, the idea of the cost benefit analysis in terms of like emotion management was not an idea that had been introduced to me until I got sober. Like, because there's like, oh, do you want to be right or do you want to have peace? Well, I'm going to say I want both.
And some things we do want to be right about. I want to be able to say that, certain forms of oppression are wrong and they're harmful. Right. Yeah. God damn it. I want to be right about that. I don't want someone to say, well, that's just your opinion. It's all relative. I have no
patience for that.
And impatience is the ruin of many great people, but no. Impatient with that view.
I'm impatient with impatience. I mean, listen, still human, right? There's
still human.
Time and a place for everything. I feel like was there something else I was supposed to ask you? Am I missing something?
I don't think so. I don't know. We've had such a far-ranging conversation. Even if
I could talk to you
I think
forever.
we filled it in with something far more interesting. So I'm going to take this for the win.
You do win. Do you want a third gold star?
Just keep giving me those gold stars.
Yeah,
I need them.
I'm a validation junkie myself. I relate. I mean, so I just really appreciate your perspective, and I love hearing how people not only just get sober, because, sobriety is just the beginning, and you mentioned that maybe one thing I was going to ask you about, you did spend a lot of time doing therapy. Was there and when I was talking to someone recently and I was telling her about a kind of therapy. She's like, I didn't know that there were kinds. She thought that there was just like CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy where you sit and talk to somebody, but there are different kinds. I recently started trying internal family systems, but I've done EMDR.
I've done that. Yeah.
Was that productive for you?
I don't know. I think because I think I couldn't overcome my skepticism and just kind of give myself over to it. I think my little rational conscious brain really tried to stay in the driver's seat on that.
Well, that's a response that's a need for safety, which is valid, right? Like typically your counselor should spend enough time with you so that you feel safe, so that you can.
Yeah, and I think I did, but I don't know. It just.
What other kinds what kind of therapy was productive for you?
Well, I think I think for me, so as someone who lives so much inside my own head, and people listening to this might say, really, you're talking a whole hell of a lot.
You're talking sense, if that helps.
I think for me, sometimes just verbalizing out loud, because
like very few behavioral therapy.
Yeah, that would work for me. But then again, that also is kind of my safe space, my overly safe space. I mean, I one time had a therapist who had to give me a list of emotions.
Oh, yeah.
And then I got into a debate with her to say, well, there are cognitive components to emotions, like trust, for example.
Yeah.
But, for me, I'm going to come back to myself on this. It was about, I have had different degrees of willingness. And when I'm most willing, it's when the most productive, probably regardless of the modality. But if I think I should be in therapy and I go in order to kind of quash that sugar to be able to say to, at least to myself, well, I am going to therapy, then that oftentimes is not. So I know
That's really good
myself well enough.
self-awareness, though.
I know myself.
Girl, that's
well
like
enough.
next level
When
self-awareness.
I'm running a scam on myself, I know myself. I have my own internal Ponzi scheme going on at times. I know myself.
Ponzi scheme. Yeah, I heard that you can't read the label from inside the jar, and that's why we go to therapy.
No, that's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Listen, I love me
but
some
I just
therapy.
come back to with sobriety, with work on yourself, whatever means work for you, and know that you may need to change your means because we're always changing. So what you might need in recovery 5 months in may be different from 5 years, maybe different from 15 years,
As it should.
As it should be, because we're always changing. And so we get to find new things. So sort of the more there's a proliferation of alternatives, then I think that's absolutely wonderful that they can be complementary and not competitive.
Not competitive.
So I'm a total pluralist when it comes to treatment modalities. I'm like,
me
try
too.
everything you can.
I never did just one thing. I mean, I know I sound like I'm a big book thumper, and I do talk about 12-step a lot just because it was when I finally surrendered to the process, it was so productive. And every time I do it, I change. Therefore, the next time I address the steps, I get something different out of it because I'm different already.
You are different.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. But some of us are sicker than others. So we need a lot of
some of us just have the opportunity for additional work on ourselves. I'm going to put it that way.
That's more compassionate.
Opportunities. Well,
unwanted opportunities.
They're unwanted opportunities, but what do we do with them? What are we willing to do?
Yeah, what are we willing to do?
What are we willing to do?
I don't know. I wouldn't have it any other way. I love this life of recovery, and I appreciate all the heart and meaning that you poured into this book, Higher and Friendly Powers, Transforming Addiction and Suffering. When I talked to you, I was like, oh, you and I are, my whole thing is I want to alleviate unnecessary suffering. I think some stuff, pain is the touchstone of all growth, but
or meaningless suffering. That's what's most intolerable is when it's meaningless.
Yeah.
You can make meaning out of your suffering when you can turn it into something good, when you can make sense with it, from it.
Yeah.
Great. But when it's meaningless or senseless, that's what's truly intolerable. If you just believe that everything that happens is meaningless.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can people find out more about you if they want to connect? Do you have a website or social media?
I do. I have a website. It's PegO'ConnorAuthor.com.
OCONNER. OR, sorry. OR author.com. Okay.
And that's the best place because there's links to a bunch of different things and other podcasts. And I write a blog for Psychology Today. You can get to it from there. And I'm working with young marketing people who are trying to get me to it.
To do all the things
more on social media. I'm like, I need to get on the TikTok. So
it's
a work in progress.
I have such a love-hate relationship with it, but it is. But it's kind of a necessary evil.
You got to meet people where they are, and that's where people are looking. I mean, there's no such thing as a lot of book reviews anymore. No, they don't happen. Really. It's just it's all different. But that's okay. That's okay.
That's okay.
I will go wherever and do whatever if I get the opportunity.
Right. Yeah. You are.
So I really appreciate it.
Yes.
And I appreciate you taking the time with me. I'm really grateful for it.
I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation even before recording. I'm so glad we got to meet today, and I look forward to visiting your website and checking out all your links and your social media, as it were.
Thanks, I think. Thank you.
Well, you have a great day. Thank you so
much.
You too.